Marriage was never something I rushed into. I believed in love, in partnership, and in building a life with someone who truly valued me. And for a long time, I thought I had that with Alex. We met in our late 20s at a corporate seminar of all places. I was there to represent my team as a marketing consultant. He was a software engineer giving a talk on automation. He wasn't the most charming man in the room, but he had a way of making me feel seen. For someone like me, who always prioritized work over relationships, Alex seemed like a blessing. He wasn't just my husband, he was my best friend, my rock, my everything. At least, that's what I believed for the first few years of our marriage. Alex had this calm demeanor that made me feel secure. He wasn't overly romantic, but he was dependable, or so I thought. As the years passed, cracks started forming in our relationship. Small at first, like tiny hairline fractures you barely notice. He worked long hours and came home exhausted. I excused it, thinking, he's providing for us. He's working hard for our future. But his time at work stretched longer and longer, and his excuses grew thinner. I began to notice the little things. The way he'd scroll through his phone during dinner. The times he'd sigh heavily when I wanted to talk about my day. The way he'd brush off my needs with a casual, "Not now, I'm busy." But I didn't complain. After all, marriage is about patience and compromise, right? That's what everyone said. I reminded myself of all the good times, hoping things would get better. I worked late hours too, and didn't always feel like the perfect wife. Maybe I was being unreasonable to expect more from him. Until my body gave me a warning I couldn't ignore. It started with exhaustion, a deep, bone-weary tiredness I couldn't shake. My head would throb after just an hour of work. I brushed it off as stress, convincing myself it was nothing. But when I fainted one morning, collapsing onto the cold kitchen floor, I knew something was wrong. Alex was in the living room when it happened. I called out to him, my voice faint and trembling. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Alex," I whispered again, clutching the countertop to steady myself. "What is it?" His tone was flat, almost irritated. I don't feel well," I managed to say, the room spinning around me. He glanced at me briefly before sighing. "Take a rest or something. You're always pushing yourself too hard." The dismissal stung more than I cared to admit. I wanted him to come to me, to hold me, to tell me everything would be okay. Instead, he turned back to his screen, his fingers clicking away on the keyboard. That night, as I lay in bed feeling weak and dizzy, I stared at the ceiling and wondered, when did we become strangers living under the same roof? The days after my collapse blurred together, but the symptoms didn't fade. The fatigue worsened, my chest felt heavy, and even small tasks left me gasping for air. Something deep inside me whispered that this wasn't just stress. I tried to tell Alex again. I needed him to understand that this wasn't just me being overworked or dramatic. One evening, I mustered the courage to sit him down. "Alex," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I think something's really wrong. I need to go to the doctor." He barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through an endless feed of whatever held his attention more than I did. "A doctor? You're probably just tired. Take some vitamins. People get burned out, it happens." "Alex, this is different," I insisted, my tone sharper now. "I'm scared. I feel weak, like my body isn't listening to me. Please." His sigh filled the room, louder than his words. "You're overthinking it. Fine, go see a doctor if it makes you feel better. But don't expect me to drop everything to go with you." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, too tired to argue. He returned to his phone as if nothing had happened, while I quietly booked an appointment the next day. The doctor's office felt cold, sterile. I explained my symptoms, the fainting, the fatigue, the heaviness in my chest. Dr. Bennett, a kind man with graying hair, furrowed his brows as I spoke. "We'll run some tests," he said gently, scribbling on his notepad. "But I won't lie, some of what you've described could point to something serious. Let's get blood work and a scan done immediately." His words felt like a punch to the gut. Serious? The ride home felt longer than it should have. When I walked through the door, Alex was sitting in front of the TV, half watching a game and half on his laptop. "How'd it go?" he asked without looking up. "They're running tests," I said, lowering myself carefully onto the couch. "The doctor thinks it might be serious." "Serious? Like what?" He glanced at me, his tone more curious than concerned. I don't know yet. I'm waiting for the results. Well, don't stress about it until you know, he said with a shrug. No point in freaking out over nothing. His words felt hollow. I wanted him to pull me close, to tell me he'd be there no matter what. Instead, he reached for the remote and turned the volume up on the game. A week later, the results came in. I received the call at work. Dr. Bennett's voice was calm but firm. Sue, I need you to come in immediately. We found something concerning in your scan. It's critical we discuss the next steps. My hands trembled as I hung up the phone. This wasn't a bad dream. It was real. That night, I told Alex everything. They found something, I said, barely able to meet his eyes. It's my heart. There's a blockage and I need surgery. Without it, my voice broke, and I couldn't finish the sentence. Alex stared at me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. Well, at least they caught it early, right? Surgery these days is pretty routine. Routine? Was that all he had to say? Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back. It's not routine, Alex, I said quietly. The doctor said it's high risk. There's a chance I might not make it. He stood up, stretching as if we were talking about nothing more important than what to order for dinner. Don't talk like that, you'll be fine. You always are. Then he walked out of the room. For the first time in our marriage, I realized I might be facing this battle alone. The days leading up to the surgery were a blur of doctor's appointments, pre-op instructions, and late-night panic. Every moment felt heavier than the last. But what weighed on me most wasn't the fear of surgery, it was the suffocating loneliness. I tried to lean on Alex to find comfort in the man I had built my life with, but he was barely present. He spent most of his time at work, and when he was home, he buried himself in his phone or disappeared into his office. The night before the surgery, I couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock on the bedside table felt like a countdown to something I wasn't ready for. I turned to Alex, who lay beside me scrolling through social media. Alex, I whispered, I'm scared. He sighed, putting his phone down with a reluctant flick of his wrist. What are you scared of? You've got the best doctors, and they're trained for this. You'll be fine. It's not just that, I said, my voice trembling. What if I don't make it? What if this is the last time we're together like this? He groaned softly, as if I were being dramatic. You need to stop thinking like that. You'll stress yourself out and make things worse. Just sleep. Tomorrow's gonna be fine. He turned off the lamp and rolled over, leaving me in the dark, literally and emotionally. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling a hollowness I couldn't describe. Was this what love had become? A partnership so fragile that even in the face of death I couldn't feel his support? The morning of the surgery, Alex drove me to the hospital. He didn't say much during the ride, and I didn't have the energy to fill the silence. When we arrived, the nurse greeted us with a warm smile. Are you ready, Sue? She asked. I glanced at Alex, hoping for some encouragement, some sign that he cared, but he was already looking at his phone, scrolling with the same detached expression he always wore. As I was wheeled into the prep area, I asked him, Will you be here when I wake up? He hesitated, then nodded. Of course, where else would I be? But something in his voice didn't sit right with me. The moments before the surgery were surreal. The sterile smell of the operating room, the bright overhead lights, the murmur of nurses and doctors preparing around me. I closed my eyes and thought of everything I'd wanted to say to Alex. Things I might never get the chance to tell him. I wanted to tell him how much I loved him, even if he hadn't shown me the same. I wanted to tell him that, despite everything, I still believed in us. But as the anesthesia took hold and the world faded to black, one thought echoed in my mind. If this is the end, I'm leaving it feeling alone. When I opened my eyes, the world felt distant and blurred, like I was drifting between two realities. The sterile smell of the hospital room grounded me. I was alive. Against all odds, I had made it through. Pain rippled through my chest as I shifted slightly, my body protesting the smallest movements. My throat was dry, and my voice came out as a whisper when I spoke. Alex? The room was quiet. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor beside me. I turned my head slowly, searching for him. The chair next to my bed was empty. No flowers, no signs of his presence. A nurse walked in, her expression warm and professional. You're awake. That's wonderful news. We've been monitoring you closely. You're recovering well. I forced a weak smile. Thank you. Was anyone here? She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with pity. Your husband left shortly after the surgery began. He said he had work to take care of. Work. The word hit me harder than I expected. He hadn't even stayed. Not for the surgery, not for the hours afterward, not to see if I'd made it out alive. The nurse must have noticed my expression because she added, "He called to check in earlier, though." As if that was supposed to make it better. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I murmured, dismissing her with a faint wave of my hand. The next few hours felt like an eternity. I replayed every moment of our marriage in my head, trying to find the point where things had gone so wrong. He hadn't been perfect, far from it, but I had always believed he cared, even if he struggled to show it. But now, lying there alone in a cold hospital bed, I couldn't ignore the truth staring me in the face. He wasn't here because he didn't want to be. Later that evening, Alex finally showed up. He strolled in, holding a bag of takeout, and wearing the same casual expression he always did, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, you're awake," he said, setting the bag on the table. "How are you feeling?" I stared at him, unable to hide the hurt in my eyes. "Where were you?" "I had a few things to handle," he replied, shrugging. "You were in surgery for hours, and I didn't think sitting around would help." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could have died, Alex? And you weren't here. Do you have any idea what that feels like? He looked taken aback, as if my reaction was unwarranted. "Sue, come on. You're fine now, aren't you? Why are we even arguing about this?" The words felt like a slap to the face. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was who he was. A man who couldn't even be bothered to stay when I needed him most. For the first time, I realized I didn't just feel lonely in our marriage. I felt abandoned. The days following my surgery were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. Physically, I was weak, fragile, barely able to sit up without help. Emotionally, I was drowning in a sea of disappointment and heartbreak. Alex's visits were sporadic, and when he did come, his time was fleeting. He'd bring coffee, mumble something about work being overwhelming, and sit on his phone for most of the visit. The few times he stayed longer, he acted like a dutiful husband in front of the nurses, asking about my medication or adjusting my blankets. But the moment we were alone, the mask slipped. One evening, I decided I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Alex," I said, breaking the silence as he sat scrolling through his emails. "Do you even realize what I've been through? What we've been through?" He sighed heavily, not even looking up. "Sue, I don't know what you want me to say. I've been here, haven't I? I brought you food, handled things while you've been recovering. What else do you expect from me?" "I expect you to care." I snapped, my voice breaking. "I expect you to show me that I matter, that I'm not just some obligation to you." Finally he looked up, his face hardening. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. You're alive, aren't you? The surgery was a success. Why can't you just focus on getting better instead of making everything about how I'm not doing enough?" His words hung in the air, cold and cutting. I couldn't believe the man standing in front of me was the same person I had once vowed to spend my life with. "Do you even love me, Alex?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling. He froze for a moment, as if the question had caught him off guard. Then he stood up, grabbing his coat. "I think you're too emotional right now. You need rest. I'll come back tomorrow." He walked out without another word, leaving me alone in the sterile silence of my hospital room. That night, I lay awake, replaying every conversation, every excuse, every moment of neglect. For years, I had convinced myself that his indifference was normal, that he showed love in his own way. But now, as I stared at the ceiling, the truth was impossible to ignore. He didn't love me. At least, not the way I needed to be loved. The next morning, a nurse came in to check on me. She adjusted my IV, chatting casually about my progress. Then, out of nowhere, she said something that shook me. "You've been so strong through all this, Sue. I don't see many patients who handle things as well as you do, especially without much support." I blinked at her, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said carefully, glancing at her clipboard, "most patients in your situation have someone by their side through every step. I just assumed your husband had commitments elsewhere." The words stung more than I expected. She didn't mean to hurt me, but her observation made one thing painfully clear. Even strangers could see how alone I was. That moment became a turning point for me. As much as I loved Alex, I couldn't keep ignoring the way he made me feel, like a burden, like an afterthought, like I was asking for too much by simply needing him. Something inside me shifted. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew one thing for certain: I deserved better. Recovery wasn't just about healing my body, it became a journey to reclaim myself. Each day in the hospital, I grew stronger, physically and emotionally. The pain in my chest began to dull, but the ache in my heart was harder to silence. Alex's visits became even less frequent. When he did come, he brought empty apologies and meaningless gestures, a bouquet of flowers tossed carelessly on the side table, or a half-hearted "How are you feeling?" before disappearing back into his phone. But something had shifted inside me. I no longer craved his approval or affection. Instead, I started asking myself questions I'd avoided for years. Why had I stayed with someone who made me feel so small? When had I started believing that my needs didn't matter? What kind of life did I want for myself now that I had a second chance? One evening, as the sun set and painted the walls of my hospital room in golden light, my closest friend Maya came to visit. She brought a warmth that filled the room. Her laugh, her stories, her unwavering support. As we talked, she leaned in closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Sue, I've known you for years. You're the strongest person I know, but you've been carrying Alex's weight for far too long. It's time to put yourself first." Her words hit me like a tidal wave. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear them. Maya helped me see what I couldn't. That Alex's neglect wasn't just a flaw in his character, it was a reflection of how little he valued me. And for the first time, I began to understand that his behavior wasn't my fault. When Alex came the next day, I was ready for him. He walked in, holding a bag of takeout, his usual indifferent expression plastered on his face. "Hey, brought you some soup. Thought you might be hungry." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a strange sense of detachment. This man, who I had once thought was my everything, now seemed like a stranger. "Alex," I said, my tone calm but resolute, "we need to talk." He set the bag down and gave me a wary look. "About what?" "About us," I said. "About what's next." He chuckled nervously, brushing it off. "You're still recovering. Let's not overthink things, okay? Focus on getting better, and we'll figure everything out later." But I didn't let him deflect this time. "No, Alex, we're talking about this now. I almost died, and you weren't there. You left me to face it alone. Do you even understand how that felt?" His face tightened. "Sue, I've been busy. I had work, responsibilities." "Stop," I interrupted, my voice rising. "This isn't about work. It's about the fact that when I needed you the most, you chose everything else over me, and now I'm realizing you've been doing that for years." He opened his mouth to argue but then shut it again, his expression unreadable. "I've spent so much time making excuses for you," I continued, "telling myself that you cared in your own way, but the truth is, you don't. And I'm done pretending that this is enough for me." For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. "Sue, come on. You're being dramatic. We've been through a lot together. You can't just throw everything away because of one rough patch." "This isn't a rough patch, Alex. This is who you are," I said firmly, "and it's not enough for me anymore." That was the moment I decided to take back control of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't move forward with someone who had already left me behind. As Alex stood there, stunned into silence, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to let go. After that conversation, Alex left the hospital without saying much. I didn't ask him to stay, and for once, I didn't feel guilty about it. There was no yelling, no dramatic farewell. Just a quiet, unspoken understanding that something had shifted between us, something irreparable. Recovery became my sole focus after that. I poured all my energy into getting stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where I questioned my decisions. But with each passing day, I felt lighter, freer, like I was shedding years of emotional baggage. A few weeks later, I was discharged from the hospital. Maya was the one who picked me up, her car filled with snacks and flowers to celebrate my release. "Here's to your new beginning," she said, raising a bottle of sparkling water as we drove away from the hospital. I laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. To new beginnings, I echoed. Back home, I faced another challenge. Rebuilding my life. Alex had sent a few texts, short, impersonal messages asking if I needed anything or if we could talk. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I finally realized I didn't owe him my time or my energy. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself rediscovering parts of me that I had long forgotten. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I reconnected with old friends, spent weekends with Maya, and even started taking morning walks, something I used to love but had given up because Alex hated waking up early. Every small step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. One day, out of the blue, Alex showed up at my door. He looked different, disheveled, tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He held a bouquet of roses, the kind he used to bring me when we first started dating. "Sue," he said softly, his voice almost pleading. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside, letting him in. Not because I wanted him back, but because I needed closure, for both of us. He sat on the couch, fiddling nervously with the flowers. "I've been thinking about everything," he began. "About us, about what happened. I was wrong, Sue. I know I let you down." I didn't say anything, letting him continue. "When you were in the hospital, I thought I had more time. To fix things, to show you I cared. But I didn't. And now I realize I might have lost you forever." His voice cracked, and for a moment I felt a pang of sadness. Not for him, but for the years we had spent together, the potential that was never fulfilled. "I'm sorry, Sue," he said, his eyes glistening. "I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. I can change. I'll be better. Just don't give up on us." I looked at him, my heart steady and calm. There was a time when I would have begged for this moment, for him to finally see what I needed from him. But now, standing here, I realized I didn't need his validation anymore. "Alex," I said gently, "I don't hate you. I don't even blame you anymore, but I've realized something important. I deserve a love that doesn't need to be begged for, and you deserve someone who can love you for who you are. That's just not me anymore." He stared at me, his face falling as the weight of my words sank in. "So this is it?" I nodded. "This is it." That moment wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As Alex left, I felt a strange sense of peace, like I had closed a chapter of my life that had been weighing me down for far too long. Months later, I stood in the park on a crisp spring morning watching the sunrise. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. Maya joined me, handing me a cup of coffee. "You look happy," she said, smiling. "I am," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet confidence. Alex had once been my world, but now I realized the most important love I could ever find was the one I gave myself. Life after Alex wasn't easy, but it was mine. Each day felt like a step toward something greater, a version of myself that I had long neglected. I started volunteering at a local art center, teaching children how to paint. Their innocent enthusiasm reminded me of the joy I once found in creativity. Watching their eyes light up with every stroke of color filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. My mornings became sacred, a time for quiet reflection, journaling, and coffee on the balcony. Maya often joked that I looked like the protagonist of a romantic movie, rediscovering herself in the city. "Any leading man in the picture yet?" she teased one evening as we shared a glass of wine. I smiled. "Not yet, but for the first time, I'm okay with that. I'm enough." Then one day, while setting up a community art exhibit, I met someone unexpected. His name was Ethan, a photographer whose work was being featured alongside mine. He had a kind smile and a warm presence that felt different, gentle but confident, like someone who had weathered his own storms. We struck up a conversation about the exhibit, which turned into coffee, then dinner. Ethan wasn't like Alex. He listened, really listened, and treated me like an equal. He didn't try to fix me or dismiss my past. Instead, he admired my strength, encouraging me to embrace the life I was building. Months passed, and our connection deepened. Ethan became a steady presence in my life, not someone I depended on, but someone who added to the happiness I had already found within myself. One evening, as we walked through the same park where I had once stood alone, he turned to me with a quiet smile. "Sue, you've been through so much," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But you're not just surviving, you're thriving. That's incredible." Alex had once been my world. But now I realized the most important love I could ever find was the one I gave myself. Life after Alex wasn't easy, but it was mine. Each day felt like a step towards something greater, a version of myself that I had long neglected. I started volunteering at a local art center, teaching children how to paint. Their innocent enthusiasm reminded me of the joy I once found in creativity. Watching their eyes light up with every stroke of color filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. My mornings became sacred, a time for quiet reflection, journaling, and coffee on the balcony. Maya often joked that I looked like the protagonist of a romantic movie, rediscovering herself in the city. "Any leading man in the picture yet?" she teased one evening as we shared a glass of wine. I smiled. "Not yet, but for the first time I'm okay with that. I'm enough." Then one day, while setting up a community art exhibit, I met someone unexpected. His name was Ethan, a photographer whose work was being featured alongside mine. He had a kind smile and a warm presence that felt different. Gentle but confident, like someone who had weathered his own storms. We struck up a conversation about the exhibit, which turned into coffee, then dinner. Ethan wasn't like Alex. He listened, really listened, and treated me like an equal. He didn't try to fix me or dismiss my past. Instead, he admired my strength, encouraging me to embrace the life I was building. Months passed, and our connection deepened. Ethan became a steady presence in my life. Not someone I depended on, but someone who added to the happiness I had already found within myself. One evening, as we walked through the same park where I had once stood alone, he turned to me with a quiet smile. "Sue, you've been through so much," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But you're not just surviving, you're thriving. That's incredible."